All right, so today we're really diving deep into drug development,
Okay.
but specifically how this process changes,
Hmm.
as the drug goes from the early phases to the later phases of development,
Yeah.
almost like from like a seed of an idea all the way to an actual medication that someone would be taking.
It's a fascinating journey, that's for sure.
And it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
No, not at all.
What's expected in terms of, the testing and the validation and all of the controls that go into making sure that this drug is safe.
Right.
It changes as that drug progresses through its development.
Absolutely. It evolves. As you learn more about the drug, you start to ask different questions. Your control strategies need to adapt as well.
Exactly. And that's what we're calling phase-appropriate expectations.
Right.
What we expect changes depending on what phase of development we're in.
I like that term. It captures the idea perfectly. You need that flexibility early on. But as you move towards those later stages, rigor and control become paramount.
And this is especially important when we're looking at some of these new types of drugs that are coming out.
Oh, for sure.
Like synthetic cannabinoids,
Yes.
psychedelics.
Those are definitely game changers.
These are potent substances.
Right.
And, even a small amount of impurity can really make a big difference.
Oh, absolutely. Purity is paramount with those types of drugs. You've got to be extremely careful right from the very beginning. And that's one of the things that's really emphasized in the ICH Q7 guidelines, those good manufacturing practices for active pharmaceutical ingredients.
Right.
It's all about that progressive stringency as you move through the development phases. The controls get tighter, the expectations get higher.
So let's unpack this a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's say you have a brand new drug candidate.
Okay.
It's shown some promise in the lab. You're ready to start testing it in humans for the very first time.
All right. So we're talking phase 1.
Phase 1.
The first in human studies.
It's really all about safety, right? Figuring out what's a safe dose, getting a handle on what the side effects might be.
That's the core of phase 1.
But from like a manufacturing perspective, what are we really looking for in phase 1?
Well, the key thing to remember about phase 1 is that you're working with a small number of participants.
Yeah,
It's not like those massive phase 3 trials.
right.
So the scale of production is pretty limited. We're not churning out millions of pills just yet.
So it's really more about like exploring and learning in that stage.
Exactly. The focus is on getting those initial insights, seeing how the drug behaves in humans, and gathering that critical safety data.
Okay. But even with all of that flexibility, we still need to make sure that we're testing the right thing.
Right. What about analytical testing in phase 1? What does that look like?
Yeah, you're right. We can't just throw caution to the wind. Analytical testing in phase 1, it's primarily about confirming the drug's identity. We need to make sure we're working with the intended drug substance and that it meets some basic purity standards.
Okay, so really making sure that it's, good enough quality for those first human trials. Exactly. We're not cutting corners, but we're also recognizing that we're still in those early stages.
So we're being cautious, but also practical.
Precisely. Finding that balance is crucial in early phase development.
Yeah, what about process validation?
Okay.
How much do we need to really nail down the manufacturing process in phase 1?
That's a great question, and it's something that often causes confusion. In phase 1, process validation is typically quite limited.
Oh, really?
Yes. It's about establishing a basic process that can produce drug substance suitable for those initial trials. But we don't need to go all out on robustness and scalability just yet.
So you're not building a whole factory just to test a few doses.
Exactly. We need to be strategic and efficient with our resources. We'll ramp up the process validation as we move into later phases.
But I do remember reading about a case, and this really kind of highlights why purity is so important, even in these early phases.
Yeah.
There was a phase 1 trial for a synthetic cannabinoid, and they had to put the whole thing on hold because they found some unexpected impurities in the drug substance.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of why vigilance is so critical, especially with these new drug classes.
Right.
Even tiny variations in purity can have significant consequences, especially when you're dealing with potent compounds.
Yeah, and you mentioned how these drugs are so potent, so it's not just about making sure the drug is there,
Yeah.
it's making sure that it's the right purity.
Exactly. You need to be confident in the quality of what you're putting into people. There's no room for error when it comes to patient safety.
Okay, so we've got this theme of exploration and flexibility in phase 1.
Yes.
But as we move into phase 2, things start to change, don't they?
Yeah.
We're expanding the pool of participants.
Right.
We're really trying to gather more evidence about the drug's effectiveness.
Yeah.
And it's short-term side effects.
Absolutely.
So what happens to our control strategies when we make that transition into phase 2?
Well, that's where things start to get a bit more serious. The stakes get higher, and the control strategies need to reflect that.
Oh, okay. So let's dive into that in our next segment.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
As we move into phase 2, yeah, it's all about kind of shifting gears a bit.
Okay.
It's not just about exploring anymore, right?
Right.
We're really starting to gather, solid evidence about how this drug is working, how safe it is.
So it's less about, is this even worth pursuing?
Yeah.
And more about, okay, let's gather some data.
Exactly. We're moving from that initial scouting mission to actually building a foundation.
Yeah.
And that means those control strategies, they got to become more robust.
Right. So it's kind of like in phase 1, we were just making sure we had the right ingredients.
Yeah.
And like a very basic recipe.
Yeah.
But now in phase 2, we're really refining that recipe.
Exactly. We're fine-tuning those measurements. We want to make sure we can produce a high-quality product every single time.
Consistently.
Yeah.
Consistently. That's the key. Okay. I'm seeing how this whole phase-appropriate thing really works.
Yeah.
So let's talk specifics.
Yeah.
Analytical testing in phase 2.
Okay.
Are we still just checking for identity and like basic purity?
Oh, we're going way beyond that now.
Okay.
In phase 2, analytical testing becomes much more comprehensive. We're not just looking for what should be in the drug,
Right.
We're also really digging deep to identify any impurities, even degradation products that might be present.
Degradation products. What are those?
So think about it this way. Some drugs, over time, they can break down or, change their chemical structure a bit. And those breakdown products, those are what we call degradation products.
Okay.
And sometimes those degradation products, they can be harmful, or they can reduce the effectiveness of the drug.
Wow. I never even thought about that. So we're not just looking for things that might have gotten in during the manufacturing process. We're also looking for things that might happen to the drug itself over time.
Exactly. It's about getting that full picture, really understanding what's in that final drug product. And that's where those ICHQ-7 guidelines come in. They really provide this framework for making sure that those active pharmaceutical ingredients are top-notch quality throughout the whole development journey.
Okay. And speaking of ICHQ-7, you mentioned earlier that they really stress this progressive stringency. So how does that apply to phase 2? Are we talking about like full compliance with those guidelines at this point?
Not full compliance just yet, but we're definitely moving in that direction.
Right.
A lot of those principles of ICHQ-7, they become really, really important in phase 2. Like, we need to start thinking about things like qualifying our equipment, making sure everyone who's involved in the manufacturing process is properly trained, and of course, documenting everything really meticulously.
Oh, right. So it's all about kind of laying the groundwork for a larger scale production.
Precisely. We're setting the stage for success in those later phases.
Okay. So it's like we're moving from that exploratory phase to more of an operational phase.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Yeah. We're still learning and refining,
Yeah.
but we're also thinking ahead.
Mm-hmm.
How are we going to scale this up? And how are we going to ensure consistency as we get to those big phase 3 trials?
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important aspect of phase 2, process validation. Remember how we talked about process validation being pretty limited in phase 1?
Yeah.
Well, in phase 2, things get a little bit more serious.
Okay. Yeah, walk me through it. What are we actually trying to do with process validation in this phase?
So in phase 2, we start to establish what we call critical process parameters. And these are like the specific variables in that manufacturing process that can really have an impact on the quality of the drug.
Okay. So it's like if you were baking a cake,
Right, exactly.
you have your ingredients, but the oven temperature, the mixing time.
Exactly. Those are your critical parameters. They make all the difference.
Yeah. So it's like figuring out which knobs to turn and how much to turn them to get the perfect batch every single time.
You got it. And we need to prove with data that our chosen manufacturing process can consistently hit those quality targets.
I can see how this is all building toward that ultimate goal, getting this drug approved, making it available to patients.
That's the end game.
But before we jump ahead to phase 3, anything else we should touch on for phase 2?
Well, one thing that's worth noting is that phase 2 is often where we see the most adjustments to the manufacturing process, I mean.
Okay.
We might need to tweak some parameters, optimize certain steps, maybe even change the drug's formulation a little bit, based on the data we're getting from those clinical trials.
So it's still a very dynamic phase.
Absolutely. You got to be ready to adapt and problem solve,
Yeah.
especially when you're dealing with those newer, more complex drugs.
Right, like those synthetic cannabinoids and psychedelics.
Exactly. Those can be tricky. But hey, that's what makes this field so exciting, right?
Yeah, yeah. Always a challenge. Okay, so we've gone through the exploration of phase 1, the refinement of phase 2.
Right.
But I know phase 3, that's where it gets real.
Oh, yeah.
Those massive trials
Right.
really make or break for a new drug.
It's the big leagues.
Yeah. So what does all of this mean for our control strategies? What changes in phase 3?
Yeah, phase 3 is it's really where all of that work comes together.
Right.
All the research, the investment, those careful control strategies we've been talking about, it all leads to this.
I mean, these trials, they're not just about showing that the drug works, right? We also need to compare it to other treatments that are already out there. See if there are any long-term side effects.
Yeah.
And gather all that data that's going to end up on the drug's label.
It's a huge, huge undertaking.
And to, meet all those demands, we have to, ramp up drug production big time.
Absolutely. We're talking like industrial scale manufacturing now.
Wow. So those ICH-Q7 guidelines, all those quality control principles, they must be absolutely critical at this stage.
Oh, they're essential. In phase 3, it's all about consistency, reliability, making sure that there's minimal variability in that manufacturing process. We need to be churning out high-quality drug substance batch after batch that meets all those predefined specifications every single time.
But how do we ensure that consistency when we're scaling up so much? I mean, it seems like the more you scale up, the greater the risk that something could go wrong.
Yeah, and you're right. The stakes are much higher. That's why process validation in phase 3 is so rigorous. It's, we're not just showing that we can make the drug. We have to prove that our process is robust, reliable, and that it can handle any kind of variations or hiccups without compromising quality.
So it's like we took that perfect recipe from phase 2, right? And we have to make sure it works perfectly even when we're cooking for, like, 1,000 people.
Exactly. And that proof, that data package that shows we have a robust and reliable process, that's what gets submitted to those regulatory agencies. That's a key part of the drug approval process. They need to know that if they approve this drug, it can be manufactured consistently and safely on a large scale.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, what about analytical testing in phase 3? I imagine it's even more intense than in the earlier phases.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about fully validated analytical methods now. These methods have to meet very strict requirements for accuracy, precision, robustness. We're talking regulatory requirements. We have to be completely sure that the results we're getting are accurate and reliable every single time we test that drug substance.
Wow. No room for error here. And I imagine the scope of testing also expands.
Right.
We're not just looking for identity, purity, degradation products anymore.
Right. We're going even deeper. We need to understand the drug substance completely. Characterize it, figure out its stability profile, how it behaves over time, how it's affected by different temperatures, storage conditions. Does it change in any way that might impact its safety or its effectiveness?
It really is like putting this drug under a microscope. And I'm really starting to see how everything we've talked about comes together here in phase 3. Analytical testing, process validation, those ICH-Q7 guidelines.
It's all connected. It's really the culmination of the entire drug development journey. It's not just checking off boxes on a list. It's about making sure that when this drug gets to patients, it's the safest and most effective it can possibly be.
That must be an amazing feeling, to be a part of that, knowing that your work has the potential to help so many people.
It really is. It's challenging work. It's demanding. It's always changing. But there's nothing like seeing a drug you've helped develop, make it all the way to market, knowing that it's out there, helping people who need it.
Well, I think this has been a really great deep dive into this whole world of phase-appropriate drug development.
Yeah.
We started with that early exploration, all that flexibility in those early phases, and we ended up here with the rigor and control of those later stages. Really fascinating.
Yeah. It's been a great discussion. Hopefully our listeners have learned a thing or two about how complex this process really is and how science and manufacturing and regulations all work together to bring a new drug to market.
Yeah. And I think, that concept of phase-appropriate expectations, that's really key. Drug development isn't just this rigid process.
No, not at all.
It's a journey. And it takes adaptability, vigilance, and a real commitment to quality every step of the way.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And, as research continues to advance and we see those newer drug classes, like those synthetic cannabinoids, the psychedelics, going through development, those principles are going to become even more crucial.
So as always, the journey of discovery keeps going. So keep exploring this world, dive into those ICH guidelines if you want to learn more, and stay curious about all the latest advancements in this field.
Thanks for joining us today.
Until next time.